Welcome back to Silicon Bites. AI fakes try to poison Ukraine's mobilization debate. Washington grants Budapest a carve-out on Russian energy. Kyiv's defense industry talks up its potential with $30 to $35 billion in the long-range output forecast for 2026. The EU tightens the screws on Russian nationals. Pokrovsk hangs in the balance, and mysterious drones snarl Belgian airspace. And finally, Germany's AfD faces sleeper cell accusations on the Bundestag floor. Let's try to anchor ourselves amidst the apparent chaos. Before we jump in, thanks to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Your support for this channel is what helps to keep it going. I can't emphasize how priceless all of your support is, and especially all those who subscribe, add comments, like, and of course, share the materials with your community. Now let's jump in to these urgent stories. AI soldiers and the mobilization disinfo surge. A new wave of AI-generated soldier videos, young men pleading that they're being forced to the front, has flooded TikTok, X, and Telegram in multiple languages this week. The goal? To erode trust in Ukraine's leadership, spook families, and fracture Western support. That's according to the Kyiv Independent. Despite the crudity and absurdity of many of the videos, some will be fooled, and it provides fodder for Kremlin assets and useful idiots to flood the zone. The Kyiv Independent reports one viral clip showing a 23-year-old conscript begging for help. Yet, Ukraine's law sets the mobilization age at 25. This tells you how bad these fakes really are. They can't even do basic research into detail. Their analysis says that some videos even carried a Sora watermark, that's an AI video production software, and that both audio and video tested as AI generated. Facial recognition processes also suggest that the base image of the people used in at least one of those videos, the basis of one of the characters, matches a Z Patriot content creator from St. Petersburg. Tears, panic, and young Ukrainian soldiers pleading for help. A new disinformation campaign is flooding social media, says the Kyiv Independent on November 7th. The messaging tries to recast the war as Zelensky's war and to dampen recruiting, donations, and put pressure on Western patients. These are classic information warfare, upgraded and upscaled at low cost by generative AI tools. Expect Kyiv and disinformation experts to publish platform takedowns and attempts at debunking this material. But here's the problem. Once the videos are out there, it's almost impossible to reach the people affected and convinced by that material. And these same people, many of them, will not be convinced by any debunking or takedowns. Others will start to be suspicious of the material and doubt their ears and eyes. But this may work to erode belief in anything. Expect phrases from such people as, "I don't know what to believe and who to believe. There's no smoke without fire." Others will fall back on an easy, weak, lazy, and cowardly response. Well, Russia may be lying, but everyone is lying, and we're all lied to. These responses are all as bad as each other. This is a cop-out. This is the cop-out I hate the most. The lazy negation of the idea of morality and truth, that there is a nuanced spectrum between good and evil, between lies and truth, and you can distinguish between them. It is the cowardly act of renouncing responsibility and the self-loathing tendency for people to annihilate their own agency, seeking instead cynicism, sarcasm, blame, resentment, and grievance instead of acting, rather than choosing to trust and put any effort into hard thinking. It's a form of gross cowardice. It's intellectually bankrupt and entirely self-destructive. But this is a classic Kremlin tactic: spread confusion and ambiguity, doubt, and ultimately distrust. It's a form of digital nihilism, and it's utterly corrosive. Unfortunately, the algorithms are aligned with the very worst behaviors and instincts of human beings. The other challenge is that by responding to fakes via social media, it acts to increase their reach and even audience penetration. The debate becomes divisive and weaponized, which acts to blow up the topic, not dampen it down. Aggressive pushback against Russian disinformation is something of a no-win scenario. Expect Moscow-aligned networks to iterate on these videos and for these materials to continue to flood the zone. Next, Washington's carve-out. Orban says that Hungary got a US sanctions exemption for Russian energy. After meetings in Washington, Viktor Orban and Hungary received a full sanctions exemption for Russian oil via the Druzhba and gas via the Turk Stream pipelines. A US official told AP the waiver is for 1 year. Orban also touted plans to buy about $600 million of US LNG and nuclear fuel from Westinghouse. That was reported in The Guardian, November 7th. We have received a full sanctions exemption for the Turk Stream and Druzhba pipelines. That's Orban, quoted by the Kyiv Independent yesterday. Reuters characterized it as a 1 year exemption, but of course, once granted, it can be extended for longer. Hungary is deeply reliant on Russian energy and has slow-rolled EU consensus on Ukraine for years. The optics of this are bad. The fact that Trump caves so easily after some apparent progress has been made the last few weeks in shutting off Russian oil markets. It bodes badly for the EU too, putting its policy in opposition to the US and reducing pressure on other member states to push ahead with a hardline move on oil and LNG. After berating the EU for its addiction to Russian hydrocarbons, this is the most grotesque hypocrisy, inconsistency, and weakness from the UN. It's a win for oligarchy, for aspiring autocrats, and a win for the Kremlin. And it creates the foundations of future division between Hungary and the EU and between the EU and the US. It is another Trump disaster in the making as he undermines his own policies and his own team. The exemption comes days after top EU figures pressed Budapest on Russia and will reverberate from Brussels to Kyiv. Analysts will watch whether this fuels more intra-EU hedging by other Moscow-friendly capitals, but the ripples could spread further. How will India and China react, who have just started to be swayed by the threat of secondary sanctions? This carve-out and cave-in by Trump gives them the signal that they too can expect exceptions if they kowtow to Trump and possibly offer him juicy projects, financial inducements, or just some shiny gold baubles to attract his wavering, wandering, and greedy attention. And Ukraine has its own energy issues, scapegoating or accountability. Zelensky blames the former grid chief of Ukrenergo. President Volodymyr Zelensky publicly blamed former Ukrenergo head Volodymyr Kruditsky for failing to protect the energy grid against Russia's renewed winter assault. The former official, detained last week in a separate embezzlement case that he calls baseless, and several observers call it politically motivated. That's according to the Kyiv Independent, November 7th. Well, we need to frame this a little, though. Is this really corruption? Was there a failure of the grid that could have been prevented? Well, these are unclear and, in some respects, contentious questions. What we do know is that the Kyiv Independent have run many stories on corruption over the last year or so and have possibly gone beyond the bounds of accurate and conservative reporting and entered the fray to undermine Zelensky. For what objectives is not entirely clear. There are many excellent journalists in that publication, but there are also here hints of a vendetta playing out. Zelensky claimed that this official was obliged to ensure security of the energy sector, and he did not. That was said in November 7th press briefing, re-reported by Kyiv Independent. Kyiv, of course, needs both accountability and continuity. Blame games, if they chill the professional decision-making inside the energy bureaucracy, can make blackouts worse. And of course, we must ask whether any preventative action was even possible. given the intensity and determination of Russian strikes to take out the Ukrainian energy sector and disrupt electricity generation this winter. Next story, Ukraine's 2026 bet $30 to $35 billion in long-range strike production. In a closed-door briefing to journalists, senior officials said that Ukraine's long-range weapons output could exceed $35 billion in 2026, with total defense industrial output potential reaching a ceiling of about 60 billion. Kiev also wants limited controlled exports to friendly nations to help self-finance the scaling up of the defense sector, reported in Interfax and Kyiv Independent November 7th. It's the industrial answer to Russia's drone saturation. Match and out-innovate. If the Danish model, that is, partners fund Ukrainian-made systems, broadens out and scales up, then the bottleneck becomes capital and electronics, that is, components, not capacity, talent, or intent. That's according to the Kyiv Independent. Ukraine is creating the foundations to become a defense powerhouse and the future arms laboratory and factory of Europe. Long term, this has huge implications as America's arms industry struggles to emerge from bloated, high margin, long timescale, and administratively sclerotic processes. The weapons powerhouse of the 21st century may become Europe instead, with Ukraine in the lead, because drone warfare is not about products. It's an ecosystem, a process, a culture, a mindset, a service even. That's how they're referring to it in Ukraine. Without extreme agility and a drive to lower the unit cost of production with every single product while turning iterations around in days, not months and years, then the old school arms industry will find itself redundant on the modern battlefield, its costly products turned to worthless scrap metal. The next story, EU tightens visas for Russian nationals on security grounds. The European Commission adopted stricter rules for Russians, no more multi-entry Schengen visas by default. Single-trip scrutiny becomes the norm, with exceptions for dissidents, journalists, and family ties. This is from the Commission implementing decision published on November the 7th from the Committee of Migration and Home Affairs. As AP framed it, the move answers sabotage and espionage fears. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas distilled the mood. Travelling within the EU is a privilege, not a right. This is one more ratchet up in Europe's whole-of-society defence against hybrid activity, from visa vetting to counter-drone nets. Cue the wail of protest from Russians who immediately squeal when their privileges or status is challenged, but few of whom lift a finger to protect universal rights and the values of others. Some have, of course, spoken out in the context of the full-scale war against Putin, but most have not. Many of those now screaming loudest about the unfairness of targeting Russians with this measure, and outraged that Europe does not consider it their human right to go wherever they want without taking any political responsibility, have not said a word about the immorality of the war or the criminal nature of the regime they enable with their passivity or even actively support through their taxes and participation in that society. Let's be clear, anyone who makes their wealth in Russia, anyone who stores their wealth in Russia, anyone who is dependent on its government or institutions, pays taxes or participates in the war machine is directly culpable for the war and the stance of its government. Anyone who peddles Russian culture while stealing the oxygen from Ukrainian stories is culpable. Anyone who refuses to support the Ukrainian war effort is culpable. None of them should be allowed into Europe, either on single trips or multiple trips, in my view. Being an active dissenter against the regime is the only valid reason, and those people we should welcome with open arms and support where we can. Next, Pokrovsk defense on a knife edge. Pokrovsk and Mirnogorod remain contested zones with mounting logistical peril. The Kyiv Independent's field reporting captures the grit and danger of staying too long in a pocket under fire. That's from November 6th. In their words, a Ukrainian drone pilot said, "It's a mess, with a bunch of our soldiers and a bunch of them, and all of them mixed together." Deep State's Roman Bocharili said, "Pokrovsk is simply being absorbed. Enemy soldiers are seeping in." Again from the same article in the Kyiv Independent, November 6th. Well, holding territory buys time. Staying too long, however, risks elite units in a vicious and chaotic meat grinder. Russians may be dispensable according to their government, but Ukraine cannot afford to lose such experienced, talented, and brave souls. Expect fierce debate inside Kiev's command about phased withdrawals versus fortress defense. This is the echoes of Bakhmut and Avdiivka, and of course the risk of repeating mistakes made in the past, lessons that have been poorly studied and poorly learnt. Well, next, drones over Belgium, airports halted, and of course the finger points towards Russia. Brussels airport saw arrivals and departures halted. Liège airport also paused flights after drone sightings. This is a first for Brussels, and it is a repeat for Liège this week. Belgium convened emergency meetings. Officials outlined a national anti-drone plan. This is reported by AP News, November 8th, and Al Jazeera. Attribution, of course, is contested once again, highlighting the very essence of hybrid warfare that builds in plausible deniability into its actions. But a Belgian source told Le Soir, reported via The Guardian, that the state actor was very probably Russia. Defense Minister Theo Fraken called the pattern hybrid techniques. This is important as Belgium hosts NATO HQ, the EU institutions, and is the clearinghouse for frozen Russian assets, and this last function may point towards the reason why Russia would choose this location and this time to mount one of its hybrid drone incursions. All reasons combined mean that this small country is a prime target for hybrid pressure operations. Of course, hybrid moves aim to exhaust, distract, and test responses, but they also aim to act as a deterrent for countries that are supporting Ukraine. That's in The Guardian. And then our final story here. This is about the Bundestag, AfD accused of a pro-Kremlin sleeper cell. German MPs used a Bundestag session to accuse the far-right AfD of acting as a sleeper cell loyal to Russia, citing a flurry of parliamentary queries on Bundeswehr kit and critical infrastructure. AfD figures denied the comments as a smear, reported via Euronews and Reuters on November 6th. CDU MP Mark Heinrichmann said the AfD was being led around by the Kremlin. SPD's Sonja Eichweder called the party a stooge of Russian interests. So is this what democratic backsliding looks like in Europe? Is Germany going down the Orban route, just at the point when the Hungarian people seem to be tiring of his endless grift and the Kremlin appeasement from the Orban regime? Well, we'll come back to this issue of hostile influence laundering in Germany, France, and the UK through populist political vehicles, new pop-up parties, in a longer episode of Silicon Bites. So let's summarize this episode. Hybrid war and an industrial race. This is what we've covered in today's stories. On the information front, AI deepfakes try to make mobilization feel illegitimate. Platforms such as X seem to have abandoned any attempt to police fakes and weaponize propaganda. Even rapid debunking of fakes cannot inoculate audiences against the lies. We covered energy and leverage. A US carve-out for Hungary complicates EU unity and the US-EU alignment. Moscow will celebrate the optics, even if the exemption is time-limited. And then there is industrial scale in Ukraine's defense sector. If Ukraine truly hits $35 billion in long-range output next year, then Russia starts to lose the drone volume advantage, and Europe gets a regional arsenal and a regional testing powerhouse in the new era of drone warfare. We also touched upon borders and skies. From EU visas to Belgian airspace, Europe is finally treating peacetime as a lost state of being, as skies become a contested environment.